أستاذ أوفيس نقفي. رحبوا معنا بالأستاذ أوفيس نقفي.
Hello? Okay, got it. So I'll introduce the panel. This is going to be a fairly wide-ranging subject. We're here to talk about really the edge of innovation in terms of automation, in terms of robotics, in terms of the Internet of Things. But I think we're going to stray into something also around social implications, what it means for the region, and what are the benchmarks. Is it really Silicon Valley, or should we be looking wider and in more relevant geographies about innovation and where it's happening? Is it China, Asia, and so forth? So I'll welcome the panelists on. We'll do some quick introductions. I'll kick off. We'll do some intros, and then we'll get into the subject matter. Thank you. So just to make put some context to this, you know, the way I see it, I mean, obviously, if you take, you know, the fourth industrial revolution, so-called, we're at a tipping point in society around the role of technology, not just as an enabler and not just as a disruptive force to traditional business, but as something that's going to completely and dramatically reshape the nature of employment, the social fabric, and human life. And we know in the region that creating jobs is a major imperative. We know that in this part of the world, we know that in the rest of the Gulf, and we generally know that also in Africa and North Africa as well. So to me, there are three dimensions to the whole question around the role of disruptive technology. One is the baseline, which is how do traditional businesses understand the nature of disruptive threat in their industry? So for example, if you take food and beverage, the single biggest disruptor to food and beverage, traditional out-of-home dining, is people staying at home. And obviously, food delivery apps have taken significant advantage of the ability to capture data, deliver, give consumers an enormous menu choice, create an enormous shopping mall and shop window of opportunity for consumers to sit at home and consume. And the reality is the traditional restaurant business is suffering accordingly. Most of the regions I've invested in have between 25 and 30% of business in restaurant going to home delivery. So that's kind of baseline number one, which is how do you understand how technology impacts your industry? And then number two is, for me, you know, how do you understand how technology acts as an enabler to existing businesses? Example, analytics and data capture, CRM technologies, and so forth. How do you get technology playing a role to understand your customers and to play a role to deepen and widen your channels? Example, education, example, healthcare, diagnostics, and so forth. And the third area, which is one of the ones we're going to concentrate on today, is around the really interesting stuff around artificial intelligence, robotics, the Internet of Things, and how the nature of employment, the nature of skill, and the nature of the social fabric of our societies gets affected. Because to me, that's quite a big preoccupation. But the important thing to recognize is where are the benchmarks and how do we prepare ourselves and where do we look to for the paradigms and comparisons? Is it Silicon Valley? Is it China? Is it Indonesia? Is it Hong Kong? Is it Mexico? Is it Lagos? Is it Istanbul? To me, that's really the story, which is let's find examples which are relevant to where we are in terms of our life stage in technology. So my name is Avers. I'm an investor, a partner with a fund called Rise Capital. We invest in emerging markets, ex-China. We have a number of companies in the portfolio across Africa, Latin America, and Asia. And previous to that, I've been in the private equity industry in the region, been here on and off for the last 20 years, and invested in businesses like Kareem and Hepsiburada. So I'm very fortunate to have a fantastic panel of highly talented people. We went through an exercise and just shared our bios with each other. and it's really a fantastic group of people. So what I'll do is talk less about myself and pass on to each person along this way. We'll do a little bit of introduction, and then I'll pick up some of the big themes and ask some questions. Off you go, Frank.
My name is Frank Salzgeber. I'm still head of technology transfer and business incubation and future innovation and venture, a very long title. I'm working for the European Space Agency. So what I'm doing is out of this world. No, just kidding. We support about 160 startups a year in our 45 incubation centers across Europe. We're thinking about that to launch that outside of Europe. And that's really everything. It can be robotic, can be a rocket company, can be a company for agriculture. We work with the agriculture industry, but also with a flying taxi. So everything where you have space, and space, when you're looking from the hotel here on the roofs, you see a lot of satellite dishes. That's space technology. Navigation in your mobile phone, that is space technology. When you make a phone call to the US, use satellites. And we have more and more data. And Saudi Arabia has a long history also with satellite and Earth observation data. This you need for agriculture, for border control, for fishing, doesn't matter. So that's in a nutshell a little bit what we do. We look sometimes a little bit long term for crazy project, what we do on near Earth orbit economy. Where's the first power station maybe on the moon? So maybe more than 2 or 3 quarters. I worked for Apple, I had my own startup company, and therefore we are the aliens in Asia.
Fantastic, thank you, Frank.
Great, how do you compete with that? That's awesome. Suleiman Al-Reza, I've been out in Asia now for almost 15 years, initially in investment banking and private equity. More recently, decided to focus on opportunities between Asia and the Middle East. Cross-border, specifically in the areas of technology. Only a few years ago, Asia was considered out of this world within the spheres of technology. Today, I would argue, and I think some of the panelists here would agree with me, today, Asia, led by China, is front and center of a lot of the technologies and innovations that are coming out that are applicable globally, but specifically also to emerging markets.
Okay. Well, Sebastian, pleasure having being here and having you all in the crowd now. I'm the founder of Tempest Capital. We are a Latin American investor focusing on the missing middle in Latam. Basically, we've seen a huge explosion in the interest in venture capital, and over the last couple decades. But we've left behind a little bit the traditional companies who are all having to deal with and become tech-enabled, right? Because in the future, all companies are going to have a tech angle, or they're going to disappear. So we tend to concentrate more on companies that are growing and developing with new technologies, but have an existing hard industry base. Before that, I ran the largest venture capital fund in Mexico, Mexico Ventures, part of Fondo de Fondos. Also ran the largest venture capital program on a fund of funds basis for Latin America. And currently, I'm a board member of the fund of funds of Saudi Arabia.
Great. Hello, good afternoon. My name is Chris Fisher. I'm based in Hong Kong, and I'm a managing partner with a fund called Click Ventures, based in Hong Kong with a global mandate. We essentially we target to invest about $1 million in each opportunity, often starting from late seed to Series A, and then sometimes follow to B, C, and a little bit later. We look for companies based upon a business model more so than any specific sectors. We look for characteristics of an investment opportunity that have a high degree of efficiency and return to network effect, return to scale based upon some kind of network effect where having more users makes the product better and helps us to generate a moat or a barrier to entry around the company, and this tends to result in winner-take-all type markets. So we like platforms, marketplaces, the kind of buyer, seller, where there's interesting data accumulated within the model so that the company just gets better and better and can provide a better consumer experience or a better end user experience through greater participation in the platform. We've invested all around the world. Our previous focus, we tended to do more in North America, including Canada and the United States. We focus a little bit outside of Silicon Valley, although we've done several Silicon Valley investments. And we also invest in Europe, mostly Northern Europe, and all over Asia. We're trying to build more and more deal flow in Asia and also build some in the Middle East and North Africa.
Thank you. Thanks. It's great being here. So thank you to everyone. I work with, my name is Ro Charles. I work on the investment team with Vickers Venture Partners. Vickers, we are probably one of the larger non-government linked venture funds in Southeast Asia. We have about $3 billion USD under the umbrella. We invest globally. So although we're headquartered in Singapore, we have 7 offices worldwide. So we're in Silicon Valley, we're in New York. We're very active in China, so Shanghai, Shenzhen, Hong Kong. We used to cover the Chinese market. And in Southeast Asia, we're active right across the region. As mentioned, we also look at the US. The reason we're in the US is we look at a lot of deep tech. We're quite active in biotech, nanosciences, and material sciences. So there's a few hubs in the world that still are producing a lot of core technology that we are actively pursuing and looking at. We primarily get involved around Series A. Series A onwards, so our first ticket size might be anything from 5 to 10 onwards. We do a lot of follow-on investments thereafter. So I cover all areas. So I look at a lot of things in mobility space. I look at things in blockchain. I look at things in the e-com space, robotics, AI. The only area I don't touch is life sciences. So we have a dedicated bio team to handle those sorts of deals.
Fantastic. So, I mean, as you can see, a very varied group of people with amazing experiences. But I wanted to kick off actually with Charles and with Suleiman, which was, you know, as you sit in Asia, where do you see, because Asia is, you know, it's not Silicon Valley, but the reality is, for me, it's more exciting and more interesting and more relevant. Mm-hmm. So what do you see happening in China, in Hong Kong, and in the rest of Asia that you think are the 3 or 4 defining factors of where disruptive technologies are likely to play a key role in evolving Asia and how they might apply to wider regions like ours? So maybe if we kick off with Suleiman, you tell us what you see in China.
I think it's interesting because you mentioned 3 pillars for how technology impacts societies. I think there's a 4th one, which I think there's a 4th one where it comes to broadening access. Yeah. And that's really where technology, I believe, has played a very impactful role in Asia, and specifically in places like China, like Indonesia, Southeast Asia more generally, and we'll see that across emerging markets. Now, just to give an example, in China, right, these are businesses that are being built from the ground up on the modern rails of technology. Take a company that everybody knows, Alibaba. Today there are 200 villages that live on Taobao, Alibaba's C2C platform. These are villages that over the last 15 years have been hollowed out due to urbanization. But since Alibaba built out its logistics and payments network, Taobao villages, these are villages that used to, at one point, were under the poverty line. Today, they've made their way up because there are certain specializations in these villages where they can now sell anywhere in China. And because they don't have the consumer class that now has moved to urban centers, because of Taobao and because of Alibaba's extensive logistics network, they can sell anywhere in China. So that's created an opportunity for villages that were potentially going to be extremely poor in China.
Good point. And Charles, do you want to have a crack also? I mean, in terms of, your investing theses.
Sure. Yeah, so with regards to China, I'll touch on China first. We used to be 100% China focused actually in some of our earlier funds. So we were very active in China. Actually, my chairman was the lead investor into Baidu. So why did he sort of form that thesis early on? So he from a macro level, we were looking at China, and he knew this is in the late 90s, early 2000s. There's clear growth drivers behind the long-term growth potential of China. And it was very clear the internet was going to fuel a growing machine in itself as well. So, we scoured the Chinese market at the time, and he decided that he wanted to be in search in China. So he looked all across China, and he identified Baidu as a company that was far better than everything else. So when people speak to him and they said, you found Baidu, that was intelligent. He says, no, actually finding Baidu wasn't the hard part, that was the easy part. It was deciding what to invest in. So how does that sort of translate today? So back in the day, we knew China was going to grow, we knew the internet was going to grow, hence we made that decision. So it was a macro decision, a macro thesis behind our investment decision. These days, going on to the follow-on, where do we see, what are we looking for the next wave of growth? We're still very warm on China. We like it. There's a lot more capital in the market now, so valuations have changed, et cetera, et cetera. But if you look at what the government is doing in terms of how proactive they're being, I mean, China really is pushing to be a tech-first nation in a very impressive way. If you look at what Premier Xi is doing, some of the mandates and directives of the government there, they're very forward-thinking. They've made a commitment to be an AI-driven nation. So they're very quick at embracing technology, and when they pursue it very hard. So China's been built on the back of a manufacturing economy. That's what it's been till date. It was the world's factory. As that's happened, it's produced an incredible amount of wealth across China. They've cut out 300 million people from below the poverty line and brought them up into upper middle classes. So there's been a massive wealth creation in China. So as that happens, the dynamics are also changing in China. So investing, what were those key first couple of layers that, the base layers, tech version 1, the foundations of the internet, et cetera, they're also evolving. So in China, what are we looking at? We are the health tech segment in China is very attractive. If you look at a lot of the inefficiencies and how things have been done there. The education sector in China is due for massive disruption, and you see it playing out with companies like Allo7 and a bunch of unicorns that are tracking forward very well. And of course AI, the AI sector in general, and you look at how China is sort of leading that sector. Why are they leading that sector? The Chinese government's very relaxed with regards to data protection for people. So what do you need for good AI? You need data. So the fact that they have low data protection for consumers is great to get rich data, and you need amount of data, and they have that. They got billion plus people. So we clearly see them leading that space. We see them overtaking the US in the space of artificial intelligence, and hence we're aggressively monitoring the space and pursuing AI companies in China. However, so are thousands of others. It's a very busy market, right? So the way we go about it is, of course, there's a specific method into what we're looking for in AI companies in China. Moving across to Southeast Asia, very different. Southeast Asia is almost where China was sort of 20 years ago. There's a lot of inefficiencies just in day-to-day life, and there's a huge, the majority of consumers in China are Class C and E consumers, so people with $2,000 to $3,000 per capita income annually. That's going to change rapidly over the next 10, 20 years, but what are the first key pieces of internet that they're going to touch? So that's why everyone's very excited about the fintech space in Asia at the moment, in Southeast Asia. You look at the unbanked population, we have 600 million people. You look at the actual full penetration of financial products serving everyone, it's incredibly low. So there's a lot of areas where technology will address and leapfrog a lot of Southeast Asian nations. So that's sort of what we look at in Southeast Asia. So in Southeast Asia, we're not looking for deep tech. In China and the US, it's probably a bit more mature technology.
Fantastic. I wanted to pick up actually with Sebastian, because obviously you've highlighted certain areas of your background. You've obviously played an instrumental role with Fundo de Fundos in Latin America, and obviously now you're here on the board of PIF. Tell us a little bit about your...
the fund of funds, not a PIF.
So just to compare Latin America to your exposure in the Middle East, how do you see the differences and the similarities in terms of entrepreneurship, opportunity, and ecosystem?
Well, it's actually more similar than one would imagine, because in the end, it's about the ability, a new ecosystem that's forming, with people learning. There's a learning curve for all the participants that are involved, and it's not just the entrepreneurs that have to, decide that they're ready, that they understand the risks, and that they have the necessary skill set to develop these ideas, which, by the way, the ideas can develop anywhere, and we're seeing that also, that ideas are running out in Silicon Valley. That's why you were seeing that the Andreessens of the world scouring the emerging markets to invest in, which, by the way, 3 years ago they vowed that they would not invest outside of the Silicon Valley. Their attitude was, if you were any good, you would go to Silicon Valley. They would actually tell us that why would they ever do that? And now they're investing in Mexico, they're investing in Latin America. It also talks about the obsolescence a little bit of the Silicon Valley model, and I think that's something very relevant that we have to talk about now. The idea that we are going to have perpetual funding for ideas, no matter how much cash they burn. We're 8 months away from probably a worldwide recession at most. And we're going to start seeing that a lot of these ideas that depend on they're not unit economics profitable, and they depend on unlimited access to funding. Well, they're going to run into trouble, and that actually defines quite a few of the players in the U.S. ecosystem. So what do we see what are we seeing in emerging markets? The delta is larger. So in the U.S., you're seeing people chasing corner problems, smaller and smaller opportunities. You're solving smaller problems. That's not necessarily bad, but it means that there's less profit in it. Obviously, it has to be a smaller business. So you're not going to get a unicorn out of a corner problem. And by the way, I hate the term unicorn, and that's probably something that also let's leave that term. Because amongst other things, you don't want to be a unicorn. You want to be the right size and you solving the right problem for your ecosystem. And there's beauty in small startups that are solving small problems, adequately sized problems at the right valuation. It can actually be very counterproductive and we've seen that also in Latin America, where some very, very promising startups became overly ambitious. They tried to imitate the Silicon Valley business model, and they went bankrupt. Emerging markets venture capital is different from Silicon Valley. And I'm saying Silicon Valley because even in the U.S., if you've ever seen venture capital in the Midwest, in the U.S. Midwest, it's actually remarkably similar to emerging markets because they don't have unlimited access to capital, right? And I think I think that's something that we saw in Latin America. The successful companies adapted to that reality. They're lean, they're mean, they can survive on a shoestring budget, and that makes them resilient. And it's going to be very interesting to see how it plays out in the next year.
And Chris, in terms of your experience also in Asia, I mean, obviously, how do you see, what's your take on the Asian success story, the contrast between the rest of Asia and China, and where you see opportunity?
Well, first of all, where Sebastian was talking about where we are in this cycle is an interesting observation. We are kind of at a later stage in a cycle. I find it instructive to look at the last cycle, the dot-com cycle, and right now, I just read that right now it costs about 10% today to start up, pretty much the same startup you would have started up in the late 90s. That's because the capital costs at the very beginning are reduced significantly by the Amazon Web Services, the Ali Cloud, Google keyword searches. Pretty much every aspect of starting up a company is reduced. So the risk is somewhat mitigated by the lower capital for startup. With that said, you're now seeing a lot more startups flooding in, and a lot of duplicate ideas where they're competing around very similar concepts. When I look at Asia, I see this has been an advantage because now you can afford to take some bets on doing a home delivery service for startup. I mean, Webvan back in the 90s in the US was a spectacular explosion, $2 billion of funding or something like that, the equivalent of it. And to build 5 distribution centers, it all failed. Now you've got Grab and you've got all these things in Southeast Asia. Their startup costs are significantly lower, and therefore they can actually really suit their market. They can provide a service that people value. So I'm bullish on some of this business model innovation. I don't think it's fundamentally exciting. It's not deep tech, but I think there's a lot of opportunities out there. Your return profile is going to be reduced. Your risk profile will stay about the same because you can make more bets. So now that's kind of Asia ex-China. China is, I also concur that China is its own thing, and India to a lesser extent. These markets have enough complexity and breadth and depth, and they're subject to the technological leapfrogging effects. So a lot of the infrastructure, they're skipping, the landlines and going straight to the cellular. They're going straight to mobile. Similar to Africa, you've got M-Pesa, things like that as well. So this kind of innovation is fundamental to these markets, I think, and it provides a very fertile area for investment.
Fantastic. So I've got
Well, I just wanted to jump in. I think maybe just bring a slightly unique angle to the China perspective as somebody who invests both in China and in the region and advises on cross-border opportunities. Specifically around the China, going out of China story, where entrepreneurs are now exploring opportunities beyond their borders. So the initial wave was in Southeast Asia, you're having a wave into India, but more and more you're getting entrepreneurs out of China who are now focusing and sharpening their pencils on the Middle East. These are entrepreneurs who've worked for Huawei, ZTE, Alibaba, big Chinese MNCs in the region. Some of them are fluent in Arabic, and are coming to pick up pockets of digital consumption that are not being competed for by the local market. Your prime example today is the only other unicorn in the region that not many people talk about. Everybody knows Kerim is a unicorn, but the other one is a Chinese company called Jolly Chick, where they just raised $300 million. Sequoia China led that round. Legend Capital has been an investor early on. Their growth in the region has been tremendous. And they're not stopping at e-commerce. They want to tackle the logistics problems, they want to tackle the payment problems, and they're hiring they're adding a lot of local content. Jolly Chick alone here has 2,000 Saudi employees just in Saudi, and only 10 Chinese. So a lot of people criticize the Chinese when they go abroad and they only hire Chinese. Actually, particularly in the tech space, it's a completely opposite situation. And we're seeing it over and over with multiple entrepreneurs that we're speaking to who are either fluent Arab speakers, Chinese Muslims, who are saying, we want to capture digital consumption in MENA. And for them, it's the prize. They've looked at Southeast Asia, they've looked at India, and they've said, MENA is the prize. Highest ARPU, highest level of engagements, and one of the lowest CACs anywhere in the world.
Absolutely. I mean, I'd mirror that as well. I mean, if you look at the acquisition of Trendyol in Turkey by Alibaba, if you look at the acquisition of Daraz in Pakistan by Alibaba as well, and if you look at the Jolly Sheikh parallel that Suleiman gave, I mean, the reality is, from Turkey to Pakistan, this could end up being a Chinese-dominated e-commerce market. Absolutely. And if you look at the partnerships Fetcher has, they're primarily Chinese as well. So I'd absolutely mirror that. I wanted to pick up actually on one point with Frank, which was around, there was an interesting observation actually this morning from somebody on a panel who talked about the quality of entrepreneurs now compared to 10 years ago. 10 years ago, he said, perhaps unfairly, it was all guys who were high school dropouts and college dropouts. Now it's kind of PhD students, people who've actually done the academics and have got an enormously sharper approach to technology innovation, analytics, and being able to bring genuine disruptive thinking as opposed to just cutting and pasting. So I just wanted to pick that up with Frank actually, which is, how do you see a difference in the quality of entrepreneurs in Europe and the rest of the regions you've invested in now compared to 10, 15 years ago?
When we started with our activity 15 years ago, 14 years ago, and trust me, a lot of people thought startups in space, you're very crazy. And now after 14 years, we have the first exits, we have the cases, we have the big cases. Nobody's laughing anymore. And this has to do also, of course, with the population. And I think when we go 15 years ago in Saudi, I think if you want to create a startup company, there was some wind maybe coming against your face. And I think in Europe it's the same. Where in the US had that, and I think that has turned. The money has turned, the perspective, because I think therefore this is what we discussed before the panel. Therefore, we need really good stories. Mm-hmm. Young entrepreneurs, old entrepreneurs, does not matter. Telling the good stories. That things go wrong. My startup also, I didn't have my own IPO because the merger was first. So was it a success or not? I think it was still a success. So I think this has turned. People were saying, I don't want to go to National Bank, I don't want to go to one of the consulting companies, I want to create my startup companies. And that we have in all areas. It's the same where working for the space agency normally is a super safe job, yeah, if you get one. But if you say, no, first I want to really shake the market doing competition. I like hardware, you know, and also that has changed. So we have more and more hardware companies. Hardware is good. I believe it because it's hard. It creates value in the region. And also maybe this we have seen as a change. The substance of the entrepreneur is more and more. Yeah, we moved a lot from software companies more to hardware companies. And maybe also this has changed, that the business model of the startups, and this is, we're going back to the discussion when you had going abroad to China, Asia, where the American business model is, we move the startup company to the Silicon Valley or to Boston. That's it, really completely. The rest of the world is more accepting that you build on cooperation. Yeah? And I think this is the opportunity for the region. It's for Asia, but also for Europe. You're saying, okay, why not, if you're 20 people, still in the early stage, just in the round A, before you're entering the MENA region, they say, okay, why not finding a local partner, a kind of cousin, who helps me to solve all the problems which I will never solve otherwise. And I think this is a thing where Badir has done an amazing job the last 2 years. I think what Navas has done is deep respect, and I think I would play that more, because this is built on trust. Maybe not a return in 2 years, but on the long term help to growth. So between the American model, which is first growth and then revenue, because the rest of the world is first growth, first revenue and then growth, I think there's a line in between, which I call the Frank model, which is built on cooperation. So, and I think this is one of the changes we have here. And the new entrepreneurs take that, because they say, we want to grow quick, but that doesn't mean that I have to set up our own office with own operation, with own people from abroad in a region which 90% fails.
I mean, you know, I think one of the themes for me which is most interesting is the social implications of what we all do for a living. I mean, if anything makes me stop and think in terms of investment decisions, it's what does that mean for wider community stakeholders? What does it mean for Nigeria? What does it mean for Pakistan? What does it mean for Kenya when you invest in a business? And the reality is that most of the businesses we invest in are not labor intensive by definition compared to traditional industry. And the reality is skill sets in our regions are not keeping up, because it takes an enormous amount of governmental public sector commitment to completely transform the nature of a workforce. I wanted to put an open question out there to the panel, which is, how do we reconcile the passion and fixation we have for technology, entrepreneurs, exciting businesses, disruption, with the potential threat to the social fabric that comes from unemployment, lack of economic opportunity across the board, and an aging population that in many countries will not have much to do. You see it in Europe, you see it in the US. Mm-hmm. How do we find a solution? And it's obviously a very big question, but how do we reconcile that as investors and entrepreneurs? And how do we think of an investment decision in a way which is a bit more inclusive? Open to anyone who wants to pick the question up.
Well, first of all, I don't see the contradiction. I think technology is the solution, not the problem. You know, I'm definitely not a Luddite. Basically, from technology for an aging population, technology is the only way we're going to be able to manage, you know, an inverted population, a severely inverted population pyramid. And that's the only way. Right now, we're going, you know, in the developed world, we're heading to a situation where you're going to have one paying in retiree to one paying in a worker to one retiree. So essentially, you have one person who has to maintain not only his family but also an additional external headcount. That's not sustainable unless you're able to extend the working life and the productivity of this older generation, and you're also going to be able to provide services at a much lower cost. That includes lower cost healthcare, that includes lower cost services, lower cost food, and obviously all of that is technology. So that is, well, technology will provide the solution. In Mexico, Latin America, like Mexico concretely, Mexico has the lowest productivity of the entire OECD. So Mexicans work the longest outside of South Koreans, and we get the lowest productivity. Lowest lowest growth in salaries in the past decade also. So we're just running, we're running in circles, going nowhere. Why? Because we're not applying sufficient technology. We have to add value to our product, to our work product. Otherwise, yes, you can be looking at it as a lower employment opportunities, but it's also such employment opportunities that are not tech-enabled provide a very low quality of life to the people who are getting those low value-add jobs. We have to find a way of providing sufficient higher value-add jobs that will not only provide minimal employment, but will provide meaningful employment for the people that are benefiting from that growth in society. We have to make sure that also that the tech-enabled growth takes care of the individuals who are left behind, because there are going to be people who are left behind, but the beautiful thing about productivity and growth is that it generates a surplus, and it's easier to spread out that surplus than to try to spread out misery.
I think on that point, I completely agree with Sebastian. We see technology as a solution. So let's look at some use cases. Sebastian sort of mentioned like financial products. Let's use an example like the Philippines, right? The Philippines, you have 100 million people. 70 million people are C&D consumers. So 70 million people are not a meaningful, attractive ARPU customer to a traditional bank, et cetera, et cetera. For a bank to open a branch and service these 70 million people, or, it's not worth the effort of the infrastructure cost to do so. A lot of digital-first businesses can address so many of these issues. So imagine once you start servicing these 70 million people, and what do they need to be serviced with? They need education. You educate your population is the fastest way to drive it forward. You service them in those areas. You make health products, et cetera, available to them. And this is how you transform a country. The difficulty that you're pointing to is society has been built offline. So we're humans, we've been built offline, and now we're shifting to a digital era. And we've already shifted, but it's always a friction point. If you have a large organization, and you go into that large organization, and that's a pen and paper organization, and you say, everyone, stop what you're doing, we're going to start doing it on computers, you're going to get pushed back, and everyone's going to say, no, it's tough, it's a hassle, I do it my way. Because there's a friction point in the changeover. And that's where we are in humans, in as a society at the moment. So we're talking about taking this fragmented sort of world that's sort of online in advanced places, a little bit offline, but we know the impact it can have on the rest of the world. How we do it is not easy. There will be, of course, attrition along the way, but society is always evolving. When farm machines came along, farmers didn't just fall over and die and everyone stopped doing it. They had to adapt. So adaptation is part of what we do as a species. And adaptation to technology is actually probably one of the next major revolutions in the course of human history. And we're sort of witnessing the changeover point.
Well, I just want to say that this trend, I believe, is accelerating. I've been fascinated by this topic of the future of work and things for quite some time. And I absolutely agree with what was just said. My concern is the human ability to adapt to change at the rate that we're getting to. I mean, and this trend may be even more dramatic in the developed markets, a place like the US, where you're going to probably lose 16 million truck driving jobs over the next 25 years, just as one example. And then never mind when that filters through the rest of the world, which I would expect to take a much longer period of time. But I think in these developed markets, there's an incentive, an economic incentive to make it happen more quickly. And also with the longevity trend, which I think you also alluded to, with the median life expectancy trending to about 100 for people under 23 or 24, I'm not sure what the latest is. But you look at somebody who's young and walking around, they're as likely to live to 100 as to not, presuming other things stay the same and that medical technology continues at the current rate. That's the expectation. So you think, so that old system of, okay, I go to college and then maybe I go out and I get a job and then I work until I'm 65 and then I retire and this just is not going to work if you're going to be productive up to 90, 100 years old. First of all, you have to save more money for your retirement. Second of all, the technology is going to change 1,000,000 times over the course of your lifetime, whereas our grandparents, very little technical, I mean, there was actually tremendous technical change, but it's accelerated so much now. They're going from electricity to telephone. Now we're going, you know, Apple iPhone iterations are, you know, a decade long, that you have just, it's unrecognizable after a decade. So the iteration is going faster. People's productivity is going to extend longer. So I think actually the whole fabric of working society has to adapt in some way. Probably you need to go to something more like a 10-year contract, like this whole lifelong employment thing. Companies don't last my entire life now. So I think this is...
And I think that's an interesting point, because what you're seeing, and I think you're seeing it at the fringes now, but might become more prevalent over the years, is the modularization of income, right? Where people, because of contract type work, you're no longer working for 25 years with one organization, but you have contracts with multiple organizations and you're doing multiple jobs where you're earning different streams of income. So you can modularize your income, earn more, potentially earn less. And that opportunity is available to a pretty wide base of potential candidates.
So I'm not so much, to be honest, I'm not so much worried, because when you're looking at over 300 years, it is all relative. And you have to see it where everybody who is a farmer and plants a forest, if it's a palm tree or a normal tree, he plants the tree not for himself or for his kid, for his grandkid. So they think already in 3 generations. Some of the family office we discussed before, they think also about 2-3 generations, because making quick money works, but it's not very effective. If you go to London, you have houses which are 150 years old and they're still in proper good shape because you adapt. Pressure is a good motivation factor. We all know that a piece of diamond is a piece of coal which was become something valuable under pressure. So, and you have to adapt. So some people will lose, yes, it's true. Yeah, that's evolution, yeah, evolve or die out. But I think this will move a society, that's normal, and entrepreneurship is one of the good guarantees to buffer this. Because if you have your own company or a share in a company, most likely you will be involved even after your retirement date. So I think entrepreneurship, and you need some big corporates, you need some new unicorns, but a wide base of good, maybe even family-owned or owner-based companies is a good substance for every earthquake that the building will maintain.
One last point also. The entire education system, the traditional education system, is obsolete. Let's be clear. So people, societies need to, can and will rapidly evolve to adapt to this necessity for rapid change. This is, necessity is going to drive the way people learn, the way they adapt, and how they eventually organize to provide a better means of production. And that also is a great opportunity for emerging markets, because that barrier of entry that existed before has essentially disappeared. You know, a kid in rural India has access to more information than a Harvard graduate had 15 years ago.
Here in the region, right, for the longest time, women have been not part of the workforce. Now they're being integrated into the workforce. The avenues for them to access the workforce are very different than they were a few years ago. Through social media, effectively, you're seeing the rise of influencers in multiple industries that are earning income on their own terms, which was not possible only a few years ago. And it's been a uniquely positive impact here, especially on the female part of the population.
What about the question, I'll labor it slightly more, which is the question around wealth distribution, because if you look at the trend in industry in the last 20 years, you've only seen actually concentration. If you take a sample of 25 top industries globally, you will find fewer players dominating market share than was historically the case. Industries were fragmented, lots of small players, lots of SMEs, mid-sized enterprises. Now it is 2 or 3 players dominating every industry to a large extent, even e-commerce. So how do we reconcile that with opportunities for the many?
I take the car industry, maybe. This is fragmentation goes back and forward. You know, it's a wave. It goes up and down. You know, when you become a bigger organization, you become less innovative. That's per default. Yeah, it's Jim Marsh was saying that in Stanford professor. If you become less innovative. If you're smaller, you can take more risk. You know, if BMW would have a self-driving car and they go bust, Germany has more than a headache. You know, if Tesla goes bust, it has an impact, but not at the same level. So they can take more risk. So this is the reason why you need startups. So I think that goes up and down, and it's like David and Goliath, and which is good.
Fantastic.
Well, I think it's a very important topic, very complex topic, and I think we have to talk about relative and absolute poverty, right, and wealth distribution. Wealth inequality is growing and probably will continue to grow, and technology will actually exacerbate that and fast track it. At the same time, absolute poverty has actually pretty much collapsed. If you look at human welfare worldwide, we're at the pinnacle of human development. And historically, society has never been in a situation where people were healthier, better educated, with more access to water, electricity, basic services, quality food. So overall, humanity is in a better place. But at the same time, we're getting a lot of social tensions from this inequality. A lot of people feel poor, even though in absolute terms they are richer. And that's a very hard topic to deal with. It does bring, there's political angles to this, there's definitely social angles. How do you make sure that you maintain that growth, but at the same time you take care of and try to minimize these growing gaps? Some people might argue whether we actually need to take care of these gaps if overall people are increasing in their general welfare. Certainly it brings out some questions about Western democracy and how stable can it be if these tendencies continue to grow, because obviously you do need certain levels of equality for that to have that political stability.
Fantastic. It's been a great discussion. I'm getting a few hand signals around having to wrap up. The time has passed really quickly because we've had such a stimulating chat. I wanted to thank the panel for a fantastic series of insights and look forward to interacting with everybody in the rest of Arabnet. It's absolutely amazing and fantastic that we're having this conversation in Saudi Arabia, in Riyadh, through Arabnet, and through all the partner organizations in this country who are supporting the drive in technology, entrepreneurship, and empowerment. So it's a fantastic, transformative moment, and it's great that we're able to participate collectively together as visitors and as nationals in this country to have this conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Shukran. Thank you, sir.